Hey, it's Mrs. Hale coming at you with the final chapter of The Gilded Age. And this chapter 26 is really looking at the westward movement of Americans. So, everything from mining to farming to interactions with the Native Americans. So, starting off, just a little bit of a nation snapshot. Realize again the enormous growth in terms of our population, but we also have a lot of increase as far as production and demand for food products, as well as different commodities and items. Within 35 years, the nation's population had more than doubled, and the number of farms had basically tripled as well. Keep in mind, we have had historical improvements in machinery, like during the market revolution, from the cotton gin to the harvesters, combines, reapers. Think McCormick, think John Deere, okay? The steel plow. And so now we're starting to look at specialization in agricultural production. So thinking about regions like Iowa is known for soybeans, for example. We don't grow citrus. That's what I mean by specialization in agricultural production, okay? The frontier will still be a symbol for opportunities for all people. And so here's just a showing of the map and settling of the West, about when states were added, where, major cities were, that type of thing is going to be, okay? So the mining frontier is something that we really haven't talked about, even when I was with the California Gold Rush. In this case, we are looking at more Colorado and Nevada, okay? And so a lot of the mining is going to take place in Boulder and Denver, Pueblo, Colorado, and we're looking at silver. It's called the Comstock Lode, and I'll talk more about that silver in Nevada. Also keep in mind, we have Swift, Armor, and Pillsbury, like the Doughboy, like woohoo. But the Pillsbury factory is going to open up in Minneapolis. Swift and Armor are going to be part of the cattle and meat packing industry. And both, or all three of these industries really helped settle the West and really took advantage of the newly developing railroad lines. Keep in mind, when people came to the West, you had previously either taken a ship from like the East Coast all the way through South America, through Panama, which was dangerous. What would happen, because we didn't have like the Panama Canal yet, you would have to go off a boat, take a railroad across Panama, and then hop back on a ship to get to like the West Coast. You could take the wagon trail and do like Oregon. You could do the Santa Fe Trail, but remember, Donner Party. And so really people are going to take advantage of the Transcontinental Railroad and all of the different railroad lines that had developed. And when I say people, I not only mean migrants, but I mean businesses as well. So the Comstock Lode that I had previously mentioned is going to be when we discover silver in Nevada, okay, and then into like Utah territory. It is named because of a miner, an American miner, Henry Comstock, okay? And the reference to lode is that it's like the silver vein that was discovered underneath. It is the equivalent of like the California Gold Rush, okay? And so this is just a look at the mining in Comstock Town, and kind of like, if you're at the very top of the image, what you see underneath is the construction of how like the shafts were built and things like that, okay? It's noticeable not just for the immense fortunes it did generate, but also for advancing the mining technology, and for extracting like silver from the ore. A lot of mines declined after 1874, especially for silver, but they would continue sporadically until the 1920s, okay? The chance of it actually striking it rich was actually pretty low. Only 1 in 500 would strike it rich. But keep in mind that in these mining towns, it's not just about striking it rich from mining, but also the establishment of restaurants, of hotels, of inns, of train locations, stuff like that. So the government did support settlement moving west. Remember the Homestead Act that had been passed. In Oklahoma in 1889, the territory of Oklahoma offered what was called a one-day land rush, where they had already partitioned off land, and you had one day to go and claim free land, and there's 2 million acres up for grabs. And so the idea was that you were not supposed to go until like a specific time on that day in 1889, and it was like gunshot, everyone go stake your claim. However, people, snuck around and basically claimed land sooner than they were supposed to, which is why Oklahoma became known as the Sooner State, because people claimed their one-day land rush land, free land, sooner than they were supposed to, but probably didn't get in trouble for it. So the cowboy frontier cattle becomes a really big business. That's like your Swift and Armor, right? The demand for beef increased after the Civil War, and so the cattle industry ended up growing as the railroad allowed for that transportation. Cattle drives and long drives were oftentimes very dangerous, moving cattle from Texas to Kansas or Missouri, and it could be costly. You have bad weather, flooded rivers, long distances, that type of idea. But from 1866 to 1900, over 20 million heads of cattle moved from Texas to Dodge City, Kansas. This is where you get different breeds of steer that get created because of like their durability, for example, like the Texas Longhorn. The end of the open range really kind of ended for a couple of reasons. One is barbed wire by Joseph Glidden, which was created in 1874. And what his invention ended up doing was it allowed for ranchers to fence off their land and to retain their cattle, which meant in turn I didn't need to pay as many workers. But the problem is that by fencing off all this land, these long drives were no longer possible. And then you have the railroads that made the cattle drive unneeded. And then it also led to the decline of the cowboy. So on the note of the cowboy, I just wanted to show you guys some images here. The image on the left is more the cowboy myth by Frederick Remington. It looks like he's a white male riding a horse in the open range. You get the stereotypical image in your head of battling natives and all the bad guys, of living your life of adventure and very unstructured. The reality is more like what you see on the right. Of the cowboys, 12% were Mexicans, 25% were African Americans. They would work long, hard days, 12 to 14-hour days, and it was often very structured. And the law that was part of the cowboy reality was often dictated by the marshals, right? Like that you would think of as in the open frontier. So the farming frontier, you have a lot of westward settlement, right, that I keep mentioning. Just some terms to realize, okay, is you have a group known as the Exodusters. The Exodusters was a movement to the west by Black Americans as an opportunity for land ownership and a true sense of democracy. This is looking at after the Civil War. Lower class whites did move west too, but very few people actually owned enough land to be profitable. However, you have what is called the safety valve theory, okay? And the safety valve theory was this idea that the frontier was a safety valve for people to move to, that you could eke out your own living. You could have that true sense of democracy, okay? And that if the cities became too crowded, if you didn't have a job, you could just simply pack up and move. It's a safety valve for you. In my notes on this slide, there's a lot more talking about the details, about the free acreage, about the life in, how many people moved west of the Mississippi River, the life that pioneers kind of lived. So what led to the decline of the farming community is going to be just like in mining, it becomes a business, okay? Instead of the individual panhandlers, eventually the mining becomes a big industrial business. Same thing with farming. You have what's called bonanza farming. It's your large-scale farms that are going to be dedicated to single crop production. And so when you couple the farming problems with increasing efficiency of agriculture, which means more products are made available, it means that, crop prices are going to drop. Okay, basic economics. More supply, not as much demand, price is going to drop. Smaller farmers did, as I've mentioned in the past, take out loans to invest in new machinery, but keep in mind when you then have the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, they're going to be in debt and need to be paying off those machine loans, and yet they're not going to be able to, which means it's going to create this vicious cycle of being in debt, going through foreclosures, that type of problem. Also, remember, I talked about the Interstate Commerce Commission, that you had to technically publish, if you're a railroad company, you technically had to publish your railroad rates. This is recalling that knowledge, and remember that farmers are going to be beholden to the railroad to ship their product, and the railroad is going to jack up their prices when and if they can. You also, for farming problems, have Mother Nature, okay? Mother Nature with grasshoppers, the drought, not grout, but all sorts of other problems that is going to lead to the decline of the farming community. And so when you have the problems of the farming community, when you have the problems of the labor movement in like the cities, you're going to see the populist party emerge. Now remember, I talked about in chapter 23, it introduced the idea of the populist party. So some of this is going to come back again. Some of it will combine with what the labor movement wanted from chapter 24 as well, as far as like income tax, looking at political participation, that type of idea. So the first group that you get introduced to is called the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. Husbandry means like animal care. This is going to be then known as the Granger movement, okay? They wanted to educate members about new developments in agriculture, like crop rotation, new equipment, new seeds, that type of idea. The point of it was to create your social and cultural bond because you are so spread out in this type of community. And so they were able to successfully grow membership of the Grangers. By mid-1870, they had 1.5 million members. And so they were able to pass what became known as Granger laws, like regulating the railroad, the grain elevator operators, that type of idea. They did go to the Supreme Court for some cases early on. Think Munn v. Illinois, they did get some successes, but then like the Wabash case set the farmers back, but created that Interstate Commerce Commission. The Farmers Alliance, you have Mary Elizabeth Lease, who is an attorney, and she said, what you farmers have to do is raise less corn and more hell. And so she basically was called like the Patrick Henry from the Revolutionary era, but the Patrick Henry of petticoats, like being a woman in skirts. And she created the foundation for the Populist Party, talking about the government should own and control major utilities like the railroad, that we should have the coinage of silver because we had found the Comstock lode. We should have graduated income tax, which should sound familiar to you from the Knights of Labor proposed idea. A direct election of senators instead of some workaround ways, and use a secret ballot. We will see those ideas come back again in the 1900s. So the Populist Party, this is just like a reminder of who they are, who were members of it, that type of idea. In the 1896 election, the idea of gold and silver is going to become a problem, namely because of the Panic of 1893. And what ended up happening is the Democrats ended up being split between the gold bugs, the people that wanted to support Grover Cleveland, and remember, Cleveland had been president, left, came back again, and then wanted to run essentially for a third term. But the Democrats were split between the big business, the industry, the people that supported gold, Cleveland, and then the populist movement within the Democratic Party that supported William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan supported more silver. And so because more like of the westward movement, the farmers are like, but we have more access to the silver, that type of idea. And so you have a speech that William Jennings Bryan said that said, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Now, 1896 election, the Democrats are not going to win, namely because of the split. And so we'll see the Republican Party come in instead. In chapter 26, we also get introduced to the Turner thesis, okay? And Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis proposed that the American character had been greatly enhanced and shaped by a vast frontier. and our character would gradually change with the closing of the frontier and the growth of urban environments. You see his direct quote below. Here's the deal about Turner's thesis. Keep in mind, since we have studied the colonies, Americans have always been enterprising. Our characteristics have always been to push west to want more. And until this point, that has held true. Even when James K. Polk, brought us from sea to shining sea, got us from, our Canada to Mexico border, from east to west coast with California, okay? Now we've achieved the dream of the transcontinental railroad to unite the nation. And the question is what is going to be our next frontier, okay? And, we would gradually change with the closing of the frontier and the growth of urban environments. So what is our next step in American development? So keep in mind, for all of this westward movement, we still have Native Americans. And the next section here is going to talk a lot about the mistreatment of the Native Americans. In the early 1860s, nearly 250,000 of Native Americans lived on the Great Plains. They relied on the buffalo herds, but then you have the Transcontinental Railroad. You have massive amount of buffalo killing, you have diseases, and their population is going to decline even more. I like this visual to show you how much of the buffalo, nearly everything, would end up being used by Native Americans. In the West, you have a group of people known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, this, if you remember when we talked about in the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and how after the Civil War, a lot of the black infantry units were disbanded, but a few of the men moved with an infantry group out west. And this is going to be your Buffalo Soldiers. They were oftentimes a segregated unit of soldiers, namely African Americans, but some Native Americans that were employed by the Army, okay? And they served a variety of purposes in the Indian Wars, and they basically worked for less money. They had poor equipment, but they persevered despite the systemic racism and prejudice that was within the military system at this time. So keep in mind the pattern of Indian relations, okay? Oftentimes, the United States government would break treaties and establish reservations to isolate the natives. They would be given poor food, poor shelter, poor farmland, okay? Because of that, it forced some of the native tribes to go more on the war path, okay? Now, as a reminder, the railroad ended up making troops and weapons more accessible as well. And so this is going to lead to a lot of either Indian wars or attempted assimilation of blending into society. So the attitudes, forced assimilation, we have the Dawes Act and the Carlisle Indian School. Those are two examples of when the American government tried to force Native Americans into white society, okay? The Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act, basically tried to say, civilize the Indians, take on an American or a white man's name, education, language, religion. We're going to divide the lands for each head of family. And it will then be also added to with the Carlisle Indian School, where people tried to civilize the children and basically send them off to boarding schools, okay? Now, a lot of humanitarians began to realize that this is disrespectful, that this was not okay treatment towards Native Americans. These quotes are harsh. This one was by Colonel Richard Pratt, he founded the first off-reservation Native American boarding school. This next one here is by an Indian school superintendent, John B. Riley. And from the 2 points that I've bolded, you guys can see the harshness that the natives would have been treated at these schooling institutions. The reason why I'm showing you this map is to show you where all different battles and massacres took place, kind of as your final series of Indian wars, okay? In 1864, you have Sand Creek, Colorado, okay? In 1866, you have going into the Bozeman Trail with Fetterman and looking at Montana and looking at a massacre there that ended with the treaty at Fort Laramie. Then you also have the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Battle of Wounded Knee as well. The last big Indian clash is a battle at Wounded Knee, and it was the Lakota tribe versus Major Woodside and Colonel Forsyth. And what started this was looking at what was called a ghost dance. Wavoka, who was a prophet within the native tribe, okay, had a vision talking about with the slaughter of the buffalo, the desperate times. And so the natives performed a ghost dance in which they would hasten or quicken the return of the buffalo, that they would help with the departure of the white settlers. And keep in mind, cultural differences. The army and the settlers didn't realize that this was a religion, not like a threatening movement. And so they feared that the Indians would end up going on a warpath. And so the army dispatched troops to the reservations in present-day South Dakota. It is said that the Sioux fired a single shot at the troops, and then the soldiers fired in return. And at Wounded Knee Massacre, 300 men, women, and children ended up being killed. So with that, okay, and in my slide notes, you have different details and information about the various Indian wars. It gets glorified, okay, as we have new shows develop and travel among the country. Vaudeville shows, part of the entertainment that you maybe read about like in chapter 25, began to highlight like the westward movement stories. And one of those was like the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, or Helen Hunt Jackson talking about A Century of Dishonor, where she focused and basically berated about the Native American mistreatment and dramatizing the problems that the Native Americans ended up suffering through. But the like Wild West shows oftentimes made fun of or capitalized on this, you know, U.S. military white man versus the Native American and just destroying them, which turned out to feed into a lot of the misperception of this time period. So chapter 26 ends with like closing up of the frontier and discussing all of these different bits and pieces between the railroading, between the mining, the farming, but of course with Native Americans as well. And with this chapter, it ends our discussion about the Gilded Age, as you kind of have looked at all the various elements of it, of being, you know, more about the scandals, the millionaires, the laborers, and now looking at the common person, the westward movement, that type of idea.